Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and depending when you're watching this video specifically, the War Within expansion is either launching today or tomorrow for the early access period. That means beta is essentially over, the expansion is practically here, and to this day many players are still struggling to figure out which class to go into main in this expansion, which has been the hardest question, especially with every single spec getting brand new talents as well as hero talents to pick from, which not only help expand on your class's identity and fantasy, but also add new gameplay components. And right now it's still really difficult to tell exactly which class is going to be the best, since tuning is by no means final. But players are still trying to put together tier lists and ideas and trying to brainstorm which classes potentially could be a good pick going forward. What would be the perfect main that would be invited into groups that would have the most amount of opportunity to grow going forward? Which one has the most amount of viability or chances of being in the top end of the end game progression? So for today's video, I wanted to throw my hat into the ring based off of everyone else's tier list, based off of the data that we've seen from the beta, based on the community perception of what we've seen so far during raid testing and dungeon testing. Take all those things, combine them cumulatively together to try to come up with a list of quote-unquote safe classes going forward, especially if you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of hours to actually spend leveling classes and you'd rather get it right the first time around. But right before we do that, if you guys do want to see more regular War Within videos, which we'll be doing starting as of the early access period, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. Otherwise, let's dive right into this list. Now, the very first class that I think is worth mentioning would be Evoker, primarily because of augmentation. However, when we do look at classes, we got to look at the entire package, but Aug, it just continues to deliver even after multiple nerfs that it saw over the last few builds of the War Within beta. Augmentation still continues to be a very unique playstyle that's primarily plays around, like, it's on paper it's a DPS class, but in reality it is so much more. It's kind of like a blend between a healer and a DPS class, where it's very much a support but in a whole entire new way, and no other class can do what augmentation can do. From the buff mechanics that it offers to the amplification of all healers, DPS, and tanks in a party, especially with the recent tank nerfs that we saw, this makes augmentation even that much more important when it comes to group content. And so far in the beta, augmentation has been highly represented, getting a lot of time and a lot of play in just about every single dungeon, and regularly showing up when it comes to players really trying to push the early content of development. Augmentation is usually there, front row seat, available in just about every one of these groups. And until we have other classes that can do very similar things, like a support role that augmentation can do, I don't really see us really switching out augmentation or evoker out of raid compositions or some of the top-end dungeon groups. So I think while it still retains this uniqueness that no other class can do, augmentation in particular is going to carry the class of the evoker. But it doesn't mean that the other specs are bad either. Preservation healing generally has been seen as a very strong competitor when it comes to the throughput classes. It is able to compete against rested druids, rested shamans, holy priests, and such. So I feel like it's still setting itself up to be in a decent spot, especially with some of the choices it has when it comes to hero talents. Devastation tuning, on the other hand, has been lower for a good portion of development, but I still feel like it has a decent profile going forward. That's a very 2-minute based profile, so you have cooldowns available every 2 minutes, which generally gives you a lot of flexibility in how you utilize those cooldowns. The damage is usually very centered around those cooldowns, which is generally good within PvE content. You just need some favorable tuning, I think, to make the Evoker class a better package, but already it's still walking in strong with just how good augmentation continues to be. From there on, the rest of the classes are going to be classes that bring something unique to the table, or at least attempt to bring something that nobody else does. And I think the class of Mage in particular is one, generally historically has been one of the safer picks, especially when it comes to PvE content. I feel like from expansion to expansion, we've seen a trend of mages performing well either in raids or in dungeons, but also in PvP. So mages generally always have had some kind of a spot where they're fairly competitive, if not dominant, at least in one of the pillars of endgame progression. And I think mages so far have had a very favorable set of tuning, especially as a spec of Arcane throughout the development cycle. But besides that though, besides the tuning, the class of mage has gone through a number of changes. It felt like we've seen a lot of classes throughout this development cycle go through big adjustments, from hunters getting entirely new class talent trees as well as spec talent trees, warlock changes, death knight changes, warrior changes, but mages continue to receive just about for like multiple weeks in a row. We've seen weeks after weeks of back-to-back mage adjustments, mage improvements, mage additions, mage changes, and each and every single one of those specs has gone through a number of updates that it feels to me that it will be very, very hard to just have so much intention sunk into the class of mage to not have them turn out to be good for any content. I feel like would be a very, very low possibility. Arcane in particular has been one of the better ones that really got a lot of quality updates. They ended up reducing some of the top end complexity for the spec, so it's a lot more approachable, especially for new players. The damage it puts out has been definitely tuned fairly favorable, and the class now has a bit more of its own uniqueness that it still continues to capture without really becoming super top end heavy and strict to play, opening up to more possibilities going forward. Fire Mage as well as Frost Mage have also got a varied talent trees that gives the mage as a class quite a varied damage profile, with Frost continuing to get updates after updates after updates, where Fire saw a lot of strong moments during the alpha and the beta. Recently, however, fire tuning has been toned down a bit. Ever since they changed how Living Bomb functions for that spec specifically, it felt like the class was literally exploding with damage, and then they kind of pulled it back, I think maybe as a kind of like a panic move to tone it down or rein it in a little bit. But what we've seen from Fire, even though right now it doesn't have the most favorable tuning, in the past when it was tuned well, or rather if it was tuned fairly, it had potential to do absolutely a monstrous amounts of damage. So I feel if the Fire Mage gets any kind of tuning, because tuning is by no means final, I feel like they could set up the class of mage into a fantastic spot. Besides this, historically mages have been a class with a great amount of mobility, fantastic defensive options, and it definitely has been a reliable class over the last few years when it comes to WoW in general. Now, another range class that I think it's easy to put on this list would be the class of Warlock, specifically because it still brings something unique to the table that no other classes do. Gateway is huge, especially in raid content. Being able to immediately position yourself from one side to the other, especially as a team, has been utilized again and again and again multiple times in a row, and allows you to even bypass certain mechanics in a very unique way. And that type of mobility is not available or doesn't exist for any other class, even as evokers can literally carry a friend over to like across a cliff or someone with the ability of rescue. They're still just not quite there when it comes to the potential that Gateway can offer. Besides this, Warlocks have gone through a number of changes that have bolstered them quite a bit, with a class challenge tree mostly being there for utility and a lot of that power kind of siphoned out and brought back into the spec trees in general. So we see an Affliction Warlock, Destruction, and Demonology getting quite a few new ways to deal damage, so the profile has gotten even more diverse than ever before. Demonology gaining access to a couple of new demons, some of them being from tier sets from Dragonflight that have been incorporated into the class talent tree, as well as some new interactions between demons that allow them to have a few new ways of approaching combat scenarios. Affliction has gained also a couple of those tier sets from other expansions as part of the class talent tree, with a couple of new choices, and even a PvP talent of Oblivion moved up a bit, so they have a bit more of a burstier profile outside of the full range of the ways that they can interact with all of their damage over time effects. And Destruction got a much needed facelift when it comes to their spec talent tree. It needed some kind of rework for a while, so it finally got it, giving it a couple of more options of how it can approach combat scenarios. On top of it, Warlocks have also got very powerful hero spec class combinations. Like Hellcaller Affliction has the most amount of dot damage in the game. The Wither dot absolutely tears things apart when it's on them, and I think this puts Affliction Warlock as one of the classes that has maybe some of the best single dot damage output for the entirety of season 1 just from a single dot of Wither. And I think this could have a lot of potential in so many PvE based scenarios, but also in PvP scenarios, got an opportunity to just get out a lot of spread wide pressure. Even though I don't see a lot of Warlocks play Soul Harvester, I've seen more of them recently, but generally Soul Harvester has not been received as positively as something like Hellcaller or Diabolus, but everybody swears by it. The damage it outputs is very, very strong for both Affliction as well as Demonology. And finally, we have Diabolus, which allows you to cycle in soul shards in order to summon greater demons than the normal demons that you can summon, and has been a very, very popular pick, especially amongst players that enjoy AoE content. So the class of Warlock like overall is looking stronger than before. It has a bit more variety in many ways that it can approach damage situations while still retaining a lot of the core uniqueness that separates it apart from other classes. Now, past those three classes specifically, I had a really hard time filling out the rest of the list of safe classes specifically, just because what is going to be safe, what is going to be guaranteed, what is going to be invited to every single group. And I think honestly, class of Shaman probably should go on this list, especially after the entire class has gotten a raid buff back in beta. In fact, the Shaman class has gone through a lot of changes for the beta specifically, and it's been a flurry of updates all out of nowhere, a bunch of tuning, a bunch of changes, but overall, I think they ended up in a very, very good spot. The addition of a raid buff that Shaman can bring makes him unique compared to some of the other classes, because now you have to have a Shaman in every single raid roster. Previously, you would have had an enhancement Shaman and like a really small melee core, but now this gives you so much more freedom than ever before. All three specs get access to Sky Fury, which is like a global, worldwide, or raid-wide Wind Fury buff that affects every ally. So it can maybe allow you to bring in maybe a few more melee than you would have if melee are tuned favorably. But also the mastery gains that it provides. Majority of classes benefit greatly from mastery as a stat, so it's a unique buff that no other class brings, and this allows you to play your Shaman not only as an enhancement for the Wind Fury buff, but you can now play Elemental and Restoration. And the talent changes that both of those two specs, the ranged Shaman specs, have been spectacular to say the least. I mean, the easiest way to put it, Shaman's got a lot of TLC this update: Tender, Love, and Care. Like, their class talent trees basically have gotten a lot more optimized, where you could pick up all of the main core components of how to make a build while also being able to fill out the rest of the talent tree with a couple of personal picks and personal choices. So you essentially can spend your class talents a little bit better when it comes to that overall talent economy. As for the specs specifically, Elemental has gone through a wide variety of changes, allowing it to create more powerful and more potent of all the builds: a Lightning build, Lava build, Elementalist build, an Ascendance build that you can now combo together with Deeply Rooted and a shorter cooldown for Ascendance or a better pace buff window word. I mean, there's so many different ways to combine it, and players have been able to mix and match it, kind of like building Lego pieces together. You can kind of deconstruct them, throw together another build, put them apart again, construct something else, and it synergizes so well no matter what kind of a build you go for, whether you go full single or lightning or lava build, or if you go mix and match for both. A lot of these builds actually tend to work pretty well. And then we have Restoration Shaman, which has also gotten a couple of key weaknesses fixed out, like having a much better spot healing, into getting damage into healing a little bit better for dungeon content, amplifying a lot of the totems, especially when it comes to the interaction that they have with the hero talents. And the hero talents for Shamans have generally been strong. Not all of them are great for fantasy or gameplay. Some of them can be passive, but generally most players perceive them as fairly strong. Whether you're playing the Totemic, Stormbringer, or the Farseer, there are some combinations that are obvious, like Stormbringer Enhancement just blows things out of the water right now. Stormbringer or Farseer Alley works really well. Farseer Resta could work really well. Totemic even has some value to it. So generally Shaman is walking into the suspension, at least based on the beta tuning, fairly strong and fairly well tuned. As for the final class to put on this list, honestly, you could just drop just about anything in here. It really comes down to a personal pick, but this one I decided to go based off of everybody's perception of classes and how they are in beta, based off all the tier lists, based on all the data we have. The one class that has been highly represented throughout the development cycle, that's been tuned so well, even after multiple nerfs, it continues to perform, is the class of Death Knight. For one reason or another, it just continues to slam damage. It continues to get play as a blood DK. Even though we saw a global nerf for all tanks in the game, the class of Death Knight continues to show up again and again, even with specs like Frost and Unholy receiving quite a lot of overall play. For some reason, they've been a consistent performer all throughout alpha, all throughout beta, even after numerous nerfs to the classes. They continue to keep improving them here and there. So unless all of a sudden they're going to gut the living hell out of Frost, Death Knight, and Unholy, I feel like they could have done that so long ago over in the beta, but they still haven't. So a lot of people rate them super highly. Death Knights are not really all super different in terms of their overall play, but they have been seeing a few adjustments in terms of the class talents, which I'll talk in a second. But primarily a lot of the benefits and power that comes from playing a Death Knight are the actual hero specs. From Rider to Sandland to Deathbringer, all of them generally are strong in their own way and found their own types of synergies that work either with Frost, Unholy, or blood. Even things like Sun Lane, which are mostly passive, still retain quite a bit of power, and all of them have their own builds that they can play into, so it opens up quite a bit of a overall more profiles for you to work with when it comes to setting up a damage build for a variety of different situations. The class talent tree as well as spec talent trees have also been optimized. Basically, it's essentially what all the other classes have gotten. A lot of the mandatory damage focused talents have been placed in a much better spot, so you have a lot more freedom on what you customize down below into the options, like buffing up anti-magic shield so it splits to multiple targets, or using it to remove debuffs, or reducing magic damage plainly, or increasing your own style of healing. Death Knights technically do have a unique mechanic of the grips and A-Bomb Limb and Gorfian's Grasp for Blood Death Knight, but some players would argue that this mechanic of grips is not necessarily unique, because technically other classes can do the same only thing Death Knights do, which is displacement, just through other means. Like, yes, you can grip an enemy from a distance to the Death Knight in order to bring him closer to the group, but you could also do the same thing with a well-placed explosive trap by a hunter to knock the enemy to the group as well. So players have been arguing recently that Death Knights technically don't bring anything unique, quote unquote, to the table, like warlocks with gates or mages or evokers, for example. But I still would say that this is the grips and the A-Bomb Limb and all those things are still a strength of a Death Knight to some degree. I will agree that it probably is not a unique mechanic or as unique as you used to back in the day, but it still is a strength that they do have slightly ahead of some of the other classes, just in the accuracy and the regularity of those grip-based abilities. As for the specs like Frost, I've seen quite a lot more capstone options that opened up the type of builds that they could play into, which has been really fun. Also optimizing some of the other baseline abilities to be a little bit more straightforward, like Pillar Frost grants you an immediate burst window, makes Frost Death Knight a lot more consistent. Unholy Death Knight talent tree has gone through a number of changes also by giving him A-Bomb in order to be able to substitute the Army of the Dead, which synergizes with things such as Rite of the Apocalypse, but also opens up a more disease-heavy build rather than an army-heavy build. With some of the capstones and talents adjusted a little bit, opens up an opportunity for them to summon more armies of undead or have stronger cooldowns to play around with, giving them a better single target or like a sustained profile versus a burst profile. But also there's been quality things like Defiant no longer granting you mastery but just being a raw damage increases, Unholy Blight being a passive that works off of your pet, saving you a couple of globals. Unholy still retains a lot of its power, but now it has a couple of different ways that you can maneuver around and talent yourself into a variety of different builds. And the nerfs of the Speckled Blood Death Knight have not really hit him nearly as hard as some of the other tanky classes, but they've also gotten a much easier way to acquire Gorfian's Grasp for a little bit better control, which I think has always been kind of one of the strengths of a Blood Death Knight to a degree. And I feel like the talent tree overall allows them to still be able to pick up a lot of the familiar talents that they usually utilize in most builds, while still being able to customize and play around with your builds overall, while still allowing them a little bit more talent points to really customize and offer a bit more flexibility of how they truly deal with majority of endgame situations. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is trying to make a guess with the unknown in mind. The unknown being the class tuning, as every single one of the classes on this list could potentially be put in the F tier easily if they're tuned unfairly. So if any of the classes we talked about in this video sound favorable to you, definitely have a pick, and I think all of them are looking like a very strong option going forward. But I would still have a backup plan just in case. Pick your main and then pick another class that you have even a mild interest in, or a class that you would want to explore. Leveling in War Within generally is quick, and having a second option to fall back on in case your initial pick ends up being undertuned or something happens and they get adjusted completely right before the raid tier hits. Having some kind of like a second option just in case, I think is going to give you better chances of walking into this expansion with someone that is viable, strong, and gets invited into groups much easier. But as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope all of you enjoyed. And if you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very, very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community because we'll be doing a lot more stuff rather than with the expansion actually launching on Thursday, Friday, depending on your region. But as always, thank you all so much for watching. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.